Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar today, which is on implementing a green recovery in Southeast Asia. So a very big welcome. This webinar is being jointly organized by the Asian Development Bank and the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, and we're delighted that you could join us. My name is Naida Krishna Morgado, and I am an infrastructure specialist at the ADB's Southeast Asia Department. Today we have about 300 odd people registered to attend, and from what I can see in the attendees going up quickly, about 120 people here already, and I hope to see evidence of this through lots of questions, comments, feedback. Please use the Q&A box. You can see on the screen, there's an icon at the bottom, the Q&A. Please feel free to put in and share your thoughts and comments and suggestions and any questions that you may have. And we have a team that's working on sending these to us and making sure that we answer them. So please do use the box. Yeah, there's a picture here. You can see where it is. Okay, that's great. Well, thanks very much for joining today. So we are still at the early end of the so-called decade for delivery. So we have around 8 years, give or take, to deliver, to make or break the Sustainable Development Goals and the the commitments made towards the Paris Agreement. These are big targets, and 2030 is a big deadline. Our region here in Southeast Asia is slowly recovering, beginning to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and the related economic crisis. And I guess the question that we are talking about today, and the question that we are asking ourselves all the time, especially policymakers in the region, but the rest of us that support policymaking and projects too, is what kind of recovery do we want to pursue? How we invest in the next 2 to 3 years with economic stimulus is really going to determine that. How do we want to make sure, how do we make sure that our future development is resilient towards future shocks? And finally, what changes do we need to make now or in the next 3 to 4 years, and then in the next 8 years, in order to meet the SDGs and the Paris Agreement? So those are the big questions that we hope we can answer, or at least begin to tackle today. The aim of this webinar is to look at the opportunities and trade-offs around green growth and a green recovery in Southeast Asia. And we have a very diverse panel from very different backgrounds to share their perspectives on these key questions. What are the opportunities? What are the trade-offs? And how can we make a change quickly? So to start with, we have a poll to check how everybody in the room is feeling and what your thoughts are on what the greatest challenges are to a green recovery in Southeast Asia. So if you could please answer the poll, and we will, you get to pick 2 questions. You get to pick 2 answers, please do. And then we will look at the answers later on. This is basically equivalent to what would be if we were in a room. I'd ask you to put your hands up, but this is kind of a more efficient way of doing it over Zoom. So, okay, well, now that we've done with our poll, I'd like to start with the opening remarks. So if I may start by requesting Mr. Ramesh Subramaniam, Director General of the ADB Southeast Asia Department, to please give his opening remarks. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naida. Very good morning to all of you. I see 157 participants now. Some of you may be joining at very early in the morning. In fact, Naida, the moderator, it's 2 a.m. for her. So special thanks to you, Naida. To all the distinguished speakers, panelists, as well as to all the participants, to all of you, very good morning, and thank you so much for joining this webinar. First, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Director Dr. Choi Shing Kwok, CEO at the Yusof Ishak Institute at ICS, for collaborating with ADB in this joint webinar and the launch of a report on implementing a green recovery in Southeast Asia. In fact, I'm standing in my office looking outside from the 6th floor. Still a fair bit of green here, but also a lot of cranes, which is good because there is recovery signs in the offing. How are we going to balance growth versus environmental considerations of greening the economy is the focus of the webinar and the publication. Over the last almost 3 years, 2.5 years to be exact, we've seen how COVID-19 has impacted on us, particularly how it has led to fairly significant loss of lives, severe economic disruptions and deterioration of growth prospects, declining fiscal position and rising public debt, and probably most importantly and worryingly, reversal of development gains that have taken at least a few decades to establish, particularly poverty reduction. Many countries have made remarkable progress. Clearly, that's an area that we need to work on. And in terms of restoring growth prospects, there is a lot of work to do. Now, as countries begin to recover, unfortunately, we also have new challenges, such as geopolitical tensions, rising oil and commodity prices, possible risks from stagflation, and more on a medium and longer term climate change challenges. In fact, the climate change challenges are real, they are now, and we need to address them starting now over the medium to longer term. Now, a key priority during recovery, we believe, is to maximize the opportunity to build back better and build back greener and ensure that the future brings a much improved set of environmental outcomes. Now, at the ADB, from a partly intellectual point of view, but also in terms of supporting countries, we wanted to be ambitious and provocative. In fact, we've been asking the question: can the Southeast Asian countries have a green deal like the EU, for instance? Now, clearly, there are challenges there in terms of achieving a green deal in the short term, but we believe certainly there are prospects, there are opportunities that we can work towards. I'll be curious to see what the poll outcome that Naida showed, the questions that she posed. Now, the study that we will cover today highlights the importance of well-designed policy measures to serve both socioeconomic and environmental aspirations. So growth, socioeconomic, and green aspirations. Now, green recovery helps reduce the risks of future pandemic, but as we saw in the video, it'll also help create jobs, which is going to be quite critical, and increase competitiveness of economies. In the study, we've identified 5 green growth opportunities. First, productive and regenerative agriculture. Second, sustainable urban development and transport models. Third, clean energy transitions. Fourth, circular economy models. And 5, probably quite critical as well, healthy and productive oceans. In Southeast Asia, that's a key aspect of many economies. Now, if fully leveraged, these could address or reverse some of the environmental damages caused by past economic activities, which have been critical, but in some cases, they've been somewhat unhampered. Now, these green growth areas were found to be relevant to a significant share, almost 60% of the SDG targets that we have in the decade for delivery, as Naida mentioned. With estimated $172 billion in capital investments, they could also generate about 30 million jobs in Southeast Asia by 2030, which is actually a pretty significant number that we can work towards. Now, while several countries in the region have developed and implemented policies to support a green recovery, more needs to be done because of the challenges, the scale of the challenges, and also particularly countries certainly will be facing fiscal consolidation. That's just a question of when, it's not a question of if. Clearly, in that context, more needs to be done. Now, we must encourage additional green stimulus, design innovative mechanisms, including, for instance, carbon pricing, reduce dependence on fossil fuel intensive power, and attract private investors to large-scale renewable energy investments, where we have seen actually very good progress in the last few years, as well as sustainable transport and clean urban projects. Now, these policies can help transition towards a greener, more inclusive and sustainable society as well as economy in the case of each country. Now, implementing a green recovery will also require mainstreaming environmental resilience in policymaking, in undertaking policy interventions in the 5 growth areas the green growth areas that I mentioned, and there could be other areas as well, and identify sources of finance or financing for green growth. Governments need to tap all possible sources to undertake green investments, we believe, because the needs are going to be quite significant. Now, while working on improving efficiency in domestic resource mobilization or revenue collection and administration, tapping other sources, including private sector, institutional investors, commercial funds, as well as regional financing facilities, is going to be quite critical. At ADB, at a strategic level, we have come up with what we call as the 3M approach. The first M stands for mainstreaming climate considerations into anything and everything that we do. We put all our investments, even including technical assistance, through this mainstreaming filter. The second M is mobilizing resources. Money is going to be critical. There are certainly lots of resources out there, but with mainstreaming and mobilizing, we need to make sure that there is a set of bankable projects always on the table that can attract the money that is available. And the third M stands for messaging, because when we look at climate change, particularly as economies begin to recover, we need to make sure that any transition that we support is just as well as it is affordable. So from that point of view, messaging to all stakeholders in all our communities, societies, economies is going to be very critical. Now, in order to support this 3M approach, as well as most importantly, probably the country's own individual strategies and goals, the 3M approach is actually quite well aligned with what the countries in Southeast Asia are proposing. We've also been working on a few innovative financing facilities and platforms, such as the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, or the ACGF, which is built on the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, which in itself is the only regionally owned vehicle by all the ASEAN countries, all the 10 ASEAN countries, and ADB holding equity position. The one of its kind in the world, the first of its kind, and probably the only one of this nature that is in existence. So the ACGF and the Green Recovery Platform, which is linked to the ACGF, was launched at COP26 in November last year. Now, Southeast Asian countries can use this facility to acquire technical assistance and loans for green infrastructure projects. We've also mobilized significant concessional financing to make the transition process easier. Also at the COP26, ADB and the governments of Indonesia and Philippines launched a partnership to establish what we call as the Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM. This is to transition from coal to cleaner sources of energy using blended finance solutions to accelerate the transition process. I mentioned just and affordable. That's going to be quite critical in the process. In parallel to these two initiatives, we also been working with the Temasek Holdings of Singapore and HSBC and established a platform called the Regen platform, asset regeneration platform, focused on the difficult to do green projects, the more amber and red projects. The two entities that I mentioned have put in equity financing, and ADB would be bringing in debt financing as well as upstream and midstream technical assistance. This facility, for initially $150 million of equity, aiming to mobilize at least close to $1 billion plus in investments, initially in Indonesia and Vietnam, to be scaled up to other countries later. And the fourth facility that we have established is called the Climate Innovation Fund, with philanthropic contributions from Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg Philanthropies, working very closely, and the fund itself administered by ADB. And finally, at the region-wide level, this is Southeast Asia as well as the entire Asia and Pacific region, we are in the process of establishing a highly innovative facility called IFCAP, that is to mobilize concessional financing for climate change investments to meet our President Asakawa's ambition of increasing our climate change investments to $100 billion by 2030 to address the 5 growth opportunities that I mentioned, as well as the other challenges. Now, we've got clearly ambitious socioeconomic and environmental goals ahead of all of us. And we need, definitely needless to say, coordinated and collective efforts from all stakeholders to come out of this pandemic better and stronger, and to be able to deal with any future crisis more effectively. Already the pathway is definitely there, and I think we can certainly do more. And finally, before I conclude, my most sincere appreciation to ICS for collaborating with us, and to all the speakers and panelists. It's wonderful to see very well-informed, capable, and people who have done fantastic work, both from academia, think tanks, as well as in the policy space. And we've got many private sector participants. Now I see 226 people on the call. So with that, let me conclude, Naida, and thanks again to all of you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Subramaniam, for your opening remarks. I'd now like to invite Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, who is the Director and CEO of the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished guests and speakers, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to everyone. First, on behalf of the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, I warmly welcome you to this webinar on implementing a green recovery in Southeast Asia. I want to thank Director General Subramaniam, and also to extend our appreciation to the rest of the ADB staff for initiating this collaboration with us in ICS, because we think this is a very important and also very timely topic. 3 years into fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe that many of us are battle weary and worn out, even though the fight is not entirely over. Although there were advocates for a green recovery in the early days of the pandemic, efforts to direct recovery measures towards a low carbon transition have been limited in our region. Research conducted by ICS in 2020 and 2021 demonstrated that stimulus packages and also parliamentary budgets have been largely focused on boosting healthcare resources, stepping up cash assistance to the most vulnerable groups in their societies, as well as fiscal support for the worst impacted sectors in the economies, such as tourism and aviation. While these measures are necessary and even laudable, the little attention paid to greening priorities have meant that opportunities that were available during this period, together with the recovery, have been so far found wanting. That said, I think there are a few exceptions that we have found. Malaysia's stimulus spending on infrastructure, it was encouraging towards energy efficiency as well as renewable energy deployment in the form of improved street lighting, rooftop solar panels, and also new transmission lines. Indonesia and the Philippines also rolled out some measures focusing on climate adaptation by enhancing disaster relief and food security. Singapore, despite its pandemic troubles, also persisted in rolling out the Singapore Green Plan 2030 and positioned itself so that when time comes, these green opportunities can be harnessed to propel its economy forward. On the flip side, some stimulus measures that have been put into practice have actually added to the climate burden. For instance, Indonesia provided tax incentives to oil and gas firms with the intention of safeguarding jobs in the industry, and reduced taxes on luxury cars to stimulate spending, while Vietnam reduced its environmental protection tax on jet fuel in order to support the aviation industry. Both of these measures missed on the opportunity to put conditions on companies to address their emissions in investing in energy efficiency or on low carbon technology. Nevertheless, this is not the full story. While stimulus measures and budgets may not have explicitly prioritized climate action, there is no doubt that some form of green transition is underway in the region. ASEAN countries are well aware of the urgency of climate action, not just to safeguard current and future generations from devastating climate impacts, but to increase energy security, expand electricity access, and benefit from emerging sectors such as renewable technology, electric vehicles, sustainable agriculture, while also preemptively lowering the chances of future pandemics and improving public health. The gears are turning in large-scale renewable projects such as Malaysia's 1 gigawatt large-scale solar program and Indonesia's 145 megawatt Sirata floating solar photovoltaic plant. Neither did ASEAN shy away from green finance. In particular, the sustainable debt market in ASEAN continued its progress in 2020 with accumulated issuance of about $12.1 billion in such instruments, which is more than 5% growth from the previous year. And this is bolstered by a combination of supportive government frameworks as well as burgeoning investment demand. In fact, COVID-19 may have sparked an uptick in social and sustainability bonds in the ASEAN market as investors recognize the need for SDG-aligned projects, thus providing opportunities for investors to diversify their portfolios. The region is steadily recovering after 3 years. ASEAN economies are projected to grow by about 5.2% this year and next year, and borders are all reopening. In 2021, the ASEAN sustainable debt market saw a record issuance of $24 billion, which was more than 76% up from the year before. ASEAN's dialogue partners are also beginning to take an interest in helping the region to decarbonize. This includes Japan's Asia Energy Transition Initiative that promises to assist countries to draw up individual roadmaps to achieve decarbonization, and the US $10 billion in finance support together with that. There's also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework's Clean Energy and Infrastructure Pillar, as well as most recently, the Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, which was launched at the G7 in order to help developing countries with clean infrastructure. All these initiatives together show that the imperative for creating new or upgrading existing infrastructure will in turn create enabling conditions for a transformative recovery from the pandemic. As countries ramp up climate ambition and both public and private actors move forward on new commitments and projects, more pieces are falling in place for a greener economic recovery. Today, we will hear from a panel of distinguished speakers on the crucial role that governments play in harnessing green growth opportunities in Southeast Asia. We'll also hear about the strategies and policy approaches that might work for the region and how to ensure that this is a transition that doesn't leave anyone behind. So finally, I heartily welcome the ADB's new report on implementing a green recovery in Southeast Asia. It will no doubt be a very instructive guide and will make a difference for all the governments and companies wanting to participate by turning words into actions so that we will have a real green recovery. And finally, I also look forward to a very robust panel discussion that will come on later during this seminar. So thank you very much. I pass it back to the moderator now.
Thank you, Mr. Choi, for your opening remarks as well, and for really setting the stage for the discussion today. So now we have the meat of the meeting, let's say to start with. We have two keynote presentations, one from ADB and one from ISIS. And these presentations will really set the stage for what we're talking about. The ADB presentation will introduce the new report, Implementing a Green Recovery in Southeast Asia. So I encourage you to tune in and listen closely. So I'd like to start by requesting Sharon Sia, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program and the ASEAN Studies Center at ISIS, Yusof Ishak Institute, to please start with the presentation. After that, we'll request ADB. Thanks, Sharon. Over to you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together. Very good morning from Singapore, and I hope you can see my screen right here. So I'm going to talk about the imperatives of a green recovery in Southeast Asia, and I hope not to take more than 10 minutes for this presentation. I think my screen is frozen. I'm going to start again. Sorry, can I get ADB to share screen for me? I think the Zoom is freezing up. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So 3 things to know about Southeast Asia's climate problem. First, it's an existential threat. And as you all know, the world has warmed more than 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it's on track to warm by 2.1 to 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. And actually what we've seen at COP26 in Glasgow last year, the agreements that were made are actually insufficient for us to maintain the pledge. So if we fail or if we regress, as we've now seen with some countries due to the fact of rising energy prices caused by the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, this warming may reach over 3.5 degrees. So regardless of efforts that we make today, we are in fact actually locked in already to a temperature increase. And this poses existential threats to Southeast Asia because, as you know, many of us of the countries in the region are actually very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and the kind of changes that's going to come on board in the next few years, in the next few decades, are actually going to threaten lives and livelihoods. The second thing to know is that it's actually disproportionate. So the disproportionality is in 2 aspects. One is in the historical emissions aspect, that actually the region's share of historical emissions compared to the top 10 emitters is low. Southeast Asia's share is only 5.6% of the global total, according to WRI figures. But future emissions trajectory is actually projected to grow in tandem with population growth and economic growth. So that's it. We now look at the impacts. So in terms of disproportionality, the impacts for Southeast Asia is actually not uniform, whether within the country or across countries. So the prediction is actually for more extreme cyclones and uneven increases in rainfall and flooding, as we are now experiencing even an inundation in some parts of mainland Southeast Asia. So that ability to adapt and to mitigate is also disproportionate because it's tied to the country's capacity and competencies to do so. And the third problem is that everybody's problem can in fact become nobody's problem, because there's the risk of doing nothing and the risk of free riding on others that can result in dire consequences for this region. So actually, according to research, some projected impacts may not actually come to pass if we can keep to a 1.5 degree trajectory, but this window for keeping to 1.5 degrees is actually fast closing. Next. I just want to speak a little bit about ASEAN's projected economic recovery. According to the ADB, the projections for this year is 2.9% of the GDP, and 4.9%, and for next year we're projected to reach 5.2%. So pre-pandemic, ASEAN was actually the 5th largest economy in 2019, and we were on track to be the 4th largest by 2030. So this rebound that we're seeing in this year is actually quite encouraging, but certain geopolitical uncertainties caused by Ukraine and Russia as well as large-scale supply chain disruptions and sustained inflationary pressures will remain a concern for us. Assuming that we weather this storm, ASEAN's population is projected to increase from 670 to 770 million people by 2040. Now, what this means is that the energy-related GHG emissions will also increase in tandem to, according to the ASEAN Center for Energy, to about 147% because of economic growth and population growth. So the burden to mitigate is high. Next slide, please. So global prices, energy prices, if you see at the graph on the right-hand side, has actually been climbing since the energy crisis started late last year. And the expectation, even as early as January this year, was that the untenable high prices was making renewable energy look quite attractive in comparison. In Southeast Asia, fossil fuel demand continues to outstrip the local production. And this demand for unabated fossil has been projected to exceed the demand for low carbon or abated fossil fuels for as far as to 2040. And according to the IEA's 2022 Southeast Asia Outlook, on the chart on the left-hand side, we'll reach over 1,800 million tons CO2. So if we keep to well below 2 degree scenario, using the announced net zero policies by our governments, we can reduce the emissions in the last bar by 2025 to 1,700 MT CO2. So the choices we make today will have huge implications for the energy choices of the future. We risk locking in fossil demand if we continue to support production through new coal power plants and other fossil-based energy production. So investments in new renewable energy infrastructure would, on the other hand, mean a fresh opportunity for this region to start afresh. Next. I want to go into a little about the regional climate attitudes towards a transition. Through 2 annual surveys done by the Institute so far, we have found that despite the COVID threat, there was strong support for prioritizing both COVID and climate emergency. And this support increased in 2021 from 2020, from 61% to 64.6%, whereas the support for focusing on only addressing COVID-19 decreased. Next. And on whether the respondents thought that government stimulus measures contributed to a green recovery, the largest group of 45.6% thought that spending was not helping a transition, whereas only 15.7% thought so. By the UNEP's calculations, less than 10% of stimulus spending by Asia-Pacific countries in 2020 was green, with the exception of Japan and ROK, where it was found that about 30% in the ROK went towards green spending. Next. Next, please. On cutting reliance on coal, we asked a question on whether ASEAN countries should cut their reliance as soon as possible. We have 79% who said that was important, whereas about 18.9% remained unsure. And you can see down in the country breakdown, Thailand is actually the outlier, and this was followed by Laos. Next. Next slide, please. Yes, another question that we asked was whether respondents are confident that adopting climate change measures and policies will drive innovation and competitiveness in their economies. And interestingly, we have here on the scale of 6.6 out of 10, showing that ASEAN respondents are fairly confident that adopting such measures will drive innovation and competitiveness. So in other words, the population, despite the COVID pandemic troubles, actually expressed confidence that taking a fresh approach and new strategies by their governments can help them and can also protect protect the environment and meet these mitigation goals, as well as provide for better employment. Next. In terms of investing in climate action, next. Yeah. So the survey results that I mentioned earlier actually gives policymakers and businesses an indication of the willingness by the public to support certain measures. It's interesting here that at last year's COP26, 8 out of 10 ASEAN member states have actually set a net zero target through political pledges or through policy documents. The only exceptions were Myanmar and the Philippines. Myanmar, due to its political troubles, perhaps was not able to set a net zero target. Now, the question here is whether these 8 countries that have expressed a net zero target have any concrete plans to achieve what they've set out to do. Next. Now, when we look at the installed capacity by energy sources in this set of data provided by the ASEAN Centre for Energy, we notice that renewables actually is the only subsector that is showing the resilience during the pandemic and has experienced capacity gains and not losses in most of the ASEAN member states. And this is as compared to the other fossil-based energy sectors. And we've also noted that governments have made significant investments in renewable energy, as Mr. Choi has said in his opening remarks, including in investing in large new projects and renewable energy targets. Next. The region has also been busy in putting in place green finance building blocks. Last year, also at the sidelines of COP26, the ASEAN finance ministers and that sectoral body actually published the first version of an ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance. What this means is that it has put in place a set of common language to guide investors and to guide economic activities and to indicate whether these activities are sustainable by their standards. The ASEAN Taxonomy Board that has been tasked to further refine the ASEAN Taxonomy has been working and engaging with stakeholders, including businesses, policymakers, academia, to ensure that eventually the taxonomy that will be in place is actually implementable and workable. The second thing we see is that there's been a growth in voluntary carbon markets in the region. There's a lot of interest from the private sector on their own volition to take part in carbon markets as a means to meet their own targets. But as, in tandem with that happening, there's also the risk of greenwashing taking place. And the last one is that governments, sorry, the previous slide, please. Governments have expressed an interest in implementing carbon pricing instruments in the region. And as Dr. Ramesh has also mentioned in his speech, the number of carbon pricing instruments that's planned or being implemented in Southeast Asia has grown. So you see in this table below, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore have either planned or implemented a carbon price tax. So for instance, in Singapore, the carbon tax was implemented in 2019 at a very low mark of $5 per ton. But this is expected, and the government has announced this year in March that it will increase to about $60 to $80 per ton by 2030. For Thailand and Vietnam, they have an ETS under consideration, and Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia are also putting their plans in place. Elsewhere in the Asia Pacific, we see China's national ETS in operation since 2021. South Korea also has one, as well as New Zealand. So the promise of coming up with a regional market where everyone can take part in is actually quite high. Next. In terms of private sector developments, what we see is that corporations in Southeast Asia have begun to adopt science-based targets, and this movement is expected to triple in 2022. In 2020 to 2021, about 15% of investments in Southeast Asia is actually related to sustainability, and half of APAC investors consider climate change in their top-tier high decision-making processes. So in terms of the private sector momentum, we definitely see it picking up pace and speed. The question is whether the governments, as Dr. Ramesh has said, are able to put up their bankable projects and investable projects for the investors to take part in. What we also see is that a large financing gap still exists, especially for infrastructure and energy. And here in a study from Bain and Temasek with contributions from Microsoft, the amount that is needed, the gap for green infrastructure is actually $2 trillion for Southeast Asia to decarbonize. And next. Just a last few notes from me. The idea of a green transition or a green recovery is certainly an exciting one, but we mustn't forget also that we have to ensure that it's not just green, but also just, equitable, and inclusive. And one of the studies that this institute has done with a group of other scholars has found that there's a need for a quality job creation to ensure decent work. So under the Paris Agreement, governments have actually committed to a just transition of the workforce and to create decent work and quality jobs. This is a key work area under the UNFCCC. Now, job creation in the renewable energy sector is key in meeting the demands of an energy transition. So employment in sectors with strong green jobs potential, such as in electricity generation, gas, steam, air conditioning, supply, it only stands at 0.5% of ASEAN's workforce, according to ILO data. Although the IRENA's projection says that ASEAN accounts for about 6% of total global employment in the RE sector. The Philippines itself is the region's biggest employer in wind energy, actually, and Vietnam is the biggest employer in hydropower. But there are certain challenges faced in ensuring a just transition. These are not unsurmountable. One is that non-fossil fuel sectors that have the most promising jobs can also have significant environmental and social consequences, such as creating impacts on biodiversity loss, terrestrial ecosystem services, and the displacement of social communities. The second is that we have to ensure that workers are upskilled to support these new green jobs. And third, we have to account for high levels of informal and vulnerable employment. So according to the ILO, more than 47% of employment is actually made up of vulnerable workers. They are more likely to experience low job security, less likely to enjoy social protection systems and employment regulation here in Southeast Asia. Laos has the highest percentage of workers, 83% in this category, and more than 50% of workers in Myanmar, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand are equally vulnerable. So I leave you with the last point, which is that we can certainly put in place KPIs for successful decarbonization. The policies that governments put in place must therefore ensure that decarbonization addresses challenges and to be more socially inclusive, ensure that women are empowered to make certain decisions, and that there's equal sustainable rural development. So the idea is to use these 3 KPIs as indicators of whether we have succeeded eventually in the years to come. Thank you very much. I also would like to end off with telling you that we are conducting our 3rd survey this year. And I would like to encourage our audience members to scan the QR code or go to the link and take the survey, which ends on the 10th of July. Thank you very much, Naida.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for setting out the imperatives for the region. And I think what resonated with me especially is the urgency that you laid out. The window for meeting 1.5 is closing fast, and the choices that we make today are critical. But I also really liked the results of your survey, which I think is a bit different than what we usually hear. Number one, that clearly from what you found from people, we need to tackle COVID and climate together. And this is as much of relevant to the public than as it is to those of us working in this field. We aren't doing enough. And I think, as you pointed out, if we do take on a green recovery, it should be good for innovation and be good for growth. So the real question now is, how do we do this? If we really want to promote green growth, what do we need to do? What do we need to do quickly? And what changes do we need to make? So now I'd like to invite Dulce Zara, who is the Senior Regional Cooperation Officer at ADB Southeast Asia Department, to present the results of ADB's new report, Implementing a Green Recovery in Southeast Asia, and to answer all these questions for us. Thanks very much, Dulce. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Naida. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a blessed day to all of you. Thank you for joining. Let me share with you some of the highlights from the featured ADB report, which is the 3rd of a 4-part series prepared under ADB's technical assistance on policy advice for COVID-19 economic recovery in Southeast Asia. As many economies in the region are slowly bouncing back from the impact of COVID-19, let us see why a return to a business as usual will not only be environmentally damaging, but also economically and socially detrimental in the long term. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the strong link between the environment and public health. Recent research finds that almost all known pandemics, including Ebola, dengue fever, SARS, MERS, and of course, COVID-19, have been caused by animal microbes that spill over to humans because of contact with wildlife and livestock. Southeast Asia is susceptible to future pandemics due to its fast-growing cities and accelerating deforestation and forest degradation. Therefore, safeguarding the environment is crucial to enhance the region's resilience against future pandemics. Studies show that heat waves, droughts, floods, and tropical cyclones have become more intense and frequent, and that the region has lost 14.5% of its forests between 2001 and 2016. The left chart shows the impacts of climate change on agriculture, tourism, energy demand, labor productivity, health, and natural ecosystems, which could collectively risk losses of up to 11% in Southeast Asia's combined annual GDP by the end of the century. Meanwhile, the chart on the right shows that biodiversity loss could place more than half of global GDP at risk. Therefore, a green recovery approach would address the severe and worsening impact of climate change and declining biodiversity in Southeast Asia. Green stimulus policies can deliver significant economic benefits. As shown on the slide and as mentioned earlier by Sharon, a study of government spending on energy technologies showed that every $1 million of spending on renewables generates 5 more jobs than equivalent spending on fossil fuels. In another study, during the global financial crisis in 2007 to 2008, green stimulus in the Republic of Korea helped the country recover faster from the economic crisis than expected and directly created 156,000 new green jobs from 2009 to 2011. Investment in clean energy also helped countries build up new and competitive green industries. The People's Republic of China, the US, and Germany became leaders in renewable energy because of these stimulus programs. Finally, a green recovery can strengthen Southeast Asia's long-term competitiveness, also as mentioned by Sharon earlier. Establishing green practices would allow countries to comply with ever more stringent regulations on the environmental footprint of imported products, such as the new EU policy on deforestation-free products, due to come into force in 2024. It is critical that Southeast Asian nations establish deforestation-free production and supply chains to stay competitive in the global market. A shift to green products would allow Southeast Asian manufacturers to take advantage of increasing demand for low-carbon technologies and products, such as smart grids, solar photovoltaics, and energy storage, markets that are projected to grow at 11% per year between 2020 and 2050. In summary, a green recovery for Southeast Asia is critical to reduce the risk of future pandemics, mitigate and adapt to the impact of climate change, create jobs, and increase competitiveness. Now, what are the growth opportunities for Southeast Asia? This slide illustrates that pursuing green opportunities in agriculture, oceans, urban and transport systems, circular economy practices, and clean energy has the potential to create 30 million jobs. The first growth opportunity is in productive and regenerative agriculture. Opportunities include using innovative technologies to support precision agriculture and applying biotechnology innovations. And the other one is improving agricultural practices. This is very relevant with food security in the region being threatened by rising fuel and food prices. Next opportunity is in sustainable urban development and transport models. Opportunities include better urban planning and updating urban management models to help cities respond to disease outbreaks. Urban transportation can also be improved by developing sustainable public transport systems and last mile connectivity options, and encouraging the shift toward electric vehicles, as mentioned earlier by Mr. Choi. The next on clean energy transitions involves developing renewable energy projects and enhancing energy efficiency. On circular economy models, the area includes investments and policies that support the processing of waste and byproducts into usable and valuable end products across various sectors. And finally, on healthy and productive oceans, this entails sustainable management of wild fisheries by ensuring biologically viable fishing levels, while improving mariculture and aquaculture to replenish overexploited fish stocks. Now, aside from generating jobs, the green growth opportunities can also help toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, investments in the 5 green growth areas will help achieve 90 to 100% of the targets for SDGs on affordable and clean energy. So ensuring access to affordable and reliable energy services. Next one is climate action. Example, strengthening resilience to climate-related hazards and disasters, and life on land. For instance, restoring degraded land and soil sustainably using biodiversity systems. These 5 green growth opportunities are highly connected, as shown on this slide. For instance, productive and regenerative agricultural techniques and technologies can lead to developing bioenergy sources, so enhancing renewable energy development, minimize the leakage of harmful fertilizers to the oceans, so we are safeguarding the health of oceans, and give rise to new circular economy models such as recycling and utilizing agricultural waste and materials. Consequently, developing measures to capture one green opportunity can have implications for others. This offers the possibility to design strategies that maximize benefits across multiple opportunities. And now we go on to how do we implement a green recovery? I will not go into the details, but I think it will be more interesting to dive into that during the panel discussion. But here are 3 key steps. The first one is to mainstream environmental resilience in policymaking. So embedding all environment considerations as much as possible in all COVID-related measures. Undertaking policy interventions in the green opportunities. As mentioned, the 5 green opportunities, we need directed policies or interventions. And finally, identifying sources of finance for green growth. I think Mr. Ramesh and Sharon have touched on those areas on finance. So some general policy recommendations include introducing carbon pricing, intensifying green technologies research, encouraging women entrepreneurs to participate in green business opportunities, and managing biodiversity better through open data systems. Throughout this process, there is a strong role for international collaboration to support knowledge and capacity building for the implementation of green recovery programs. My presentation ends here. Thank you. And you can access the report through this link. Back to you, Naida.
Thank you very much, Dulce. So if I can summarize very quickly, I take away 3 numbers, not 5, sorry, 3 numbers from your presentation. 5 areas that we need to work on. 172 billion per year is what it's going to cost us to work on those areas. And 30 million jobs is what we'll create by 2030 if we take on these 5 areas. Thank you for that summary and for the report, which I hope everybody will access and have a look at in their own time. And I hope it'll serve as a good source of information as we design economic stimulus and recovery strategies in the region. So now we have gone through our 2 keynote presentations. I'd now like to have a discussion with our excellent panel who come from quite different backgrounds and different countries. And I'd like to have a discussion around what the trade-offs and opportunities and trade-offs are around adopting these 5 green growth areas and reacting to the urgency that was laid out by Sharon in her keynote presentation. So I'll start by introducing the panel. We have 4 panelists with us: Mr. Jayant Menon, who's Senior Fellow at ISIS, Ms. Ponaria Siahan, who's CEO of Yayasan Care Paduli, Mr. Ferry Akbar Pasaribu, who's Deputy Assistant for Investment Strategy at the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime and Investment Affairs in the Government of Indonesia, and Mr. Parosh Hutacharan, who is Senior Expert on Bond Market Development at the Public Debt Management Office, Ministry of Finance of Thailand. So welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us today. Before I start with some panel questions, I wanted to check if the ADB team would like to put up the responses to the poll that we did earlier, where we were trying to get a feel for how people in the room are perceive green growth. So now if I have a look at this, we asked what do you think are the 2 top challenges to taking on a green recovery in the region? And what we can see is absence of political will. Okay, that's one. And then there's a little bit of a split between corruption, poor governance, and inability to mobilize public and private finance. So let's say that's, number 1 is political will, and number 2 is a close call between financing and governance related issues. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, ADB team, for that. So I'll ask the panelists to maybe think about that a little bit before they come in. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to pose a question to each panelist and ask them to respond. And then if we have time, we'll do a second round. I will also look at some of the questions coming in on Q&A. There are 14, and I'm going to start going through them in a little bit. To start off with, I'd like to pose a question to Mr. Menon. Jayant, so thanks for joining us today. You heard what I think both Dulce and Sharon laid out in their presentations, and Dulce especially laid out, what a menu for a policy agenda for green growth and green recovery could look like. I think one of the key things to any policymakers in the room, and I'm sure both Mr. Pasaribu and Mr. Hutacharan would agree with me, key is to be able to measure how successful any program is that the government takes on. So I would ask, in addition to thinking about what you've heard and reflecting on that, what do you think would be the strongest economic indicators or other indicators of a successful green recovery if we were able to implement it? If you could start with that, please, sir. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naida. I take it you can hear me. You'll tell me if you can't, I'm sure. Right. So let me start by saying how pleased I am to be back and to be part of this event with my current employer and my former employer, this first joint event. It's lovely to be here, and how much I enjoyed listening to both Sharon and Dulce present on a topic which, I have to admit, I'm not an expert on, but none of us can ignore these issues now, because as was very clearly described, these are cross-cutting issues that affects everything, the existential challenges that we face. Can I start by just making one comment from the perspective of trade economists, which is what I am about the presentations, and then deal with the particular question you raised, but I think the two are linked. I think from a trade perspective, I see quite a few parallels between the challenges posed by the green recovery or the environmental challenge and trade reform. And I think what we can take away from the lessons of trade reform is that there are 2 types of challenges. One is selling an idea that has short-term adjustment costs, but long-term gains. And this is where the whole urgency issue that Sharon emphasized comes into play. And it's made more difficult at the moment with heightened uncertainty. We're just coming out of a pandemic and, staring at potential global recession. Even stagflation has been raised as a concern. So right now, if you could find a time to do this, type of reform, this would not be the right time. But then we don't have time. That's the problem. So it's short-term pain for long-term gain, selling that idea at a very difficult time. The second parallel I see with trade reform is how the costs of these sorts of changes that are required tend to be concentrated amongst a small group, but the benefits are thinly dispersed across a much wider community. In fact, all of us. And this is where it becomes difficult to sell the idea given that reality. The costs are concentrated, and people that suffer have a great incentive to organize and to press governments to protect their employment. Coal mine workers is just one example. But the benefits accrue thinly to everyone, and so the incentive to try and protect those might be much less. So these are the challenges I think we face, which are similar to trade policy reforms. But the good news is that despite these difficulties, trade reforms have succeeded over time. And we've seen them happening because of concerted global and regional efforts in bringing about these reforms, as well as unilateral actions by individual countries, recognizing that it's in their own interests to make these changes. So the bottom line is that the challenges are great, but if the trade experience is any guide, the news is also good, that in the long term that we will benefit. So let me just quickly then talk about your question. I'm sorry about that long response to the presentation, but I thought this was an interesting parallel I wanted to share. But in terms of the indicators, I think what we should, as Sharon has pointed out, in the short term, we're expecting quite a strong rebound in Southeast Asia, much more than any other region in the world, actually. There might be some downgrading that will dampen that recovery, but it won't derail it. So I think we're looking good at the moment in terms of growth recovery. The question is how much of that will translate into green recovery. And here, I think the indicators we should focus on are the SDGs, which have a deadline of 2030. And the point I want to make here is that this region was already falling behind those SDG targets before the pandemic started. And this made the effects of the pandemic a lot worse. But what this now means is that progress towards the targets have been slowed even further. So we're caught in this vicious circle, which we need to break. And I think, as Dulce highlighted, we need the right kind of investments to play a key role in moving towards those targets. Now, financing will be the constraint, and this will, be made more difficult right now with rising fiscal deficits and debt from the pandemic spending that we've seen. I think institutions like ADB must play that role in helping get that financing through. And maybe a good start would be to start reducing subsidies to fossil fuels, which are in the billions. Of course, difficult right now with rising oil and gas prices. But if those savings, if that can be done, the savings could be used for investment in energy transition, all the better. So I think the SDGs is what I would like to focus on, as long as growth is not derailed going forward. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jayant. And I think the point that you make and the parallels that you draw with trade reform is an interesting one I haven't heard before. But I think you're right about the trying to communicate better that short-term pain and long-term gain, or as I would argue, short-term pain to avoid longer-term a lot more pain, maybe. It's kind of critical, and especially for policymakers. So we have two policymakers in the room today that we will come to in a bit. But I'd like to maybe turn over to Bona now. Bona, from your perspective, one of the key points with this 30 million jobs or so that we want to create, one of the key things is going to be to make sure that those jobs are really inclusive and are really, targeting, as Jen pointed out, the small number of people that have to bear the costs of the transition. So how can we ensure, for example, that any of the jobs created through green growth, or how can governments ensure really deliver proportionate benefits, especially for women? What do you think from the perspective of the work that you do?
Thank you very much, Sharon, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting Keir to join this important webinar on green recovery. And this discussion couldn't be any more urgent at this point of time. So as we all have acknowledged that we're just coming out of a pandemic, but it still has lingering effects. In fact, there's a report that was just released recently also on lingering effects of COVID, particularly on women and girls. I believe ADB is also a co-sponsor of that, together with UN Women, which showed also that there's an increase of the gender inequalities and how it has very severely impacted on women. For example, on unpaid care and domestic work, there's an increase by 30 to 40% on women spending more hours on domestic chores and losing jobs. At the same time, we also understand the gender dimension of climate change and impact on women. Various studies have showed, for example, chronic hunger mostly experienced by women and girls. And if we go back to about the message in this report, I think we all agree on the need for a green recovery. But I think the point that, and I like the 3 KPIs that Sharon highlighted earlier, which includes also inclusion and women empowerment or gender equality. How do we ensure that this green recovery is equitable and just? That we need to address already existing inequalities, including gender inequality, which has been further exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So one of the things that I also want to highlight, one report, and I think it's also highlighted also in this report about the entrance of women in the green jobs, mostly at lower level. And in fact, there's a link in Global Green Skills report, which was just released in February, that showed 66% of transitions into green jobs have been made by men, with fastest growth among those with bachelor's degree or higher education. We know that, that there is a significant gender gap in girls accessing STEM, science, technology, engineering, math subjects. And this actually becomes a high risk for girls in the future, as well as women, to actually access benefits, opportunities in the green growth opportunities. If the transition will require a shift in skills, which also could, of course, impede existing jobs, this will require women to be reskilled. The question is, how can we ensure those women and girls can access those opportunities by equipping them with the needed skills and ensuring that they are able to actually access and benefit education, technical assistance, and capacity building that will ensure their ability to enter that job market. It's interesting to see how from the poll that 22% of the response showed that there's lack of technical assistance, and we're talking about broadly about the subject. You can imagine that how much of that technical assistance is also targeted specifically on women and girls being able to reskill themselves to enable them get better jobs should this green job transition take place. The opportunities is wide, but making them able to access that is the biggest issue. So one of the things that's highlighted in this report, it's about the 3 steps, which includes also targeted policies on those 5 economic opportunities in green growth. But I think what we should also include is about targeted policies on women and girls to be able to access opportunities and benefits in those 5 areas. Because most of the time, we see that opportunities and benefits for women and girls becomes an add-on or a residual effect. And even if there are, and many examples, even in care, we have programs that actually links women benefiting in adaptation programs, and green growth jobs opportunities. But it's community level, it's mostly very low skilled. So how do we actually upgrade that? How do we actually open the access much better? So I think one of the things that we have to do is making sure that there are targeted policies within those targeted policies in the sector that ensures women and girls are part of that integral to the policies, and the strategies are specific. That there are specific targets or quota, if needed, that women and girls should be, in the education sector as well as in the job sector. The second is also, how do we also make sure that financing allocation is directed, targeted for women and girls? Most of the time, in fact, I just want to take a parallel here. We work in the humanitarian sector. And it's interesting how even in the humanitarian sector, there isn't not even 10% of the allocation is targeted specifically for women and girls, or vulnerable groups, despite the fact that they are the most severely affected during a crisis or disasters. So we're talking about a different sector. I'm just comparing that within a sector that is so much related to women and children in terms of the impact. I think the third one is also, how do we make sure that as a result of the pandemic, let me just backtrack a bit. As a result of the pandemic, and I think if you look at that report from UN Women and ADB showed also that in 2020 and 2021, there's a significant dropout of girls from schools. And in Indonesia itself, there's an increase by 10 to 15% of child marriages. So how do we reach out specifically to those that are on the brink of dropping out, or those that are already out of school, to bring them back to the education sector, to be able to equip themselves better to actually access these opportunities? I think these are three things that we should really be looking at in terms of opportunities and benefits for women and children and girls. And I think one point that I do want to reemphasize, that we shouldn't consider women and girls as an add-on or residual. Because I think one of the things that we need to be careful is that when I look at the 5 principles of designing green growth policies in the report, one of them talks about capture complementary benefits where possible. And the examples that's given is how women can benefit from that. So I think we should not look at that as complementary only, but it's also an integral part of the goal and target and the strategy. Let me stop there, and then we can continue discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pona. And it's a really good point that you make, that we need targeted skill development. We need targeted policy to have greater access to STEM for girls and for women. And that's a good takeaway, I think, in terms of designing green growth policies. I know that we're quite short on time now, so I'd like to turn over to Mr. Ferry Pasaribu from Indonesia. So I'd like to ask, in the context of what we've discussed today, and you saw from the poll too that financing is one of the issues. So what can governments do to mobilize the private sector to invest in green infrastructure? And what are some of the examples that you're seeing coming out of Indonesia?
Thank you, Neida. Hi, Jayan, Bona, and Parochi. Nice to meet you all. And I've been enjoying the discussion this morning. Your question is really tough to be answered, just to be very frank with you, because even though we've already, of course, factor in the energy mix, the renewable, our renewable in our energy mix, but its implementation is still facing a lot of challenges. For instance, I would quote the report by 2021. By the end of 2021, Indonesian, in our energy mix, the renewable support is only hovering at 11.7%. So to be honest, it's behind the targeted mix that we've already foreseen before. And then I'm quite worried as well, because by 2025, that will be a new government though. The mix should be, I mean, renewables should contribute by 23%. So it's still a long way to go. We're not even half of it yet. That's why incentives, I think, should be worked on, and we've already had some incentives to attract more private investments in renewable energy. First, this is like I think this is a very traditional way of trying to attract investors. Investors is the tax holiday, but it is true. Tax holiday is being designed, or it is being structured by the Minister of Finance. The idea is we want to help more to help foreign and domestic investors alike to go into renewable energy. And then, as you see it as well, we're trying to develop less how to say that, less fossil fuel in our transportation system. For instance, I think we've been quite successful in developing our electric vehicle industry, starting from its upstream down to the downstream, down to the downstream. We work with China and Korea, and I guess that would be a big bang on reducing our dependence on fossil fuel fired transportation system. And you see, even in Jakarta, we start seeing more electric buses rolling out. So I guess it's a clear indicator that the government is really serious. Even though, of course, if you talk about Indonesia, it's only about Jakarta alone, but at least we started already. And then our financial authority has already launched the green taxonomy, we call it. So there is 919 industrial sectors that are considered as green, even though they need to be verified further. But the idea is our banking and financial institutions are incentivizing banks and financial institutions to finance green investments. So there would be incentives. There would be a lower interest rate, for instance, if you are investing in green projects. And also, for instance, just to give you a perspective, some of our banks have been responding quite strongly. Even in 2021, by the end of 2021, one of the largest lenders in Indonesia, Bank Mandiri, has already invested around $12 billion in renewable, in sustainable sector. So that includes all the less fossil industry. Less emission industries, and also the private owned bank, such as Bank Sentral Asia, has already invested financed a lot of projects as well, amounting to $10.2 billion. So, but this has not reflected the prowess of our banking industry, because the majority of our banks are still banking in sort of traditional sectors, right? This is the challenge, because there's money domestically, and there's a demand from the private sectors that are willing to go to the other than the let's say green investment. And then sometimes they just like seeing whether or not they would make profit, right? So this is the challenge, and the government has set up a regulatory framework as well to incentivize against as part of it is green taxonomy, as I said. But other than that, Minister of Finance has been working very hard to design a more attractive green investment. Again, we're not yet that really successful in creating a environment where private investors are willing, just like immediately going to green investment, because if you look at the Indonesian economy, we are still very much dependent on coal, right? So 36% of our energy is still supplied by coal. I couldn't blame anyone, but we are sitting on one of the largest coal reserves in the world. So it takes, it takes a uphill battle to really change even the economic structure for Indonesia. If you want to go to green economy, that doesn't mean you can do it just within 5 or 10 years. It takes, I think, decades, right? Because you have to change the economic structure of a country. And even if I mention some developed countries that, that had proclaimed that they are really into renewable. But if you remember, when we stopped exporting coal a couple of months back, these so-called developed countries that proclaim themselves are already going into renewable, they came to us. They sent their ministers, requesting that, hey, please sell coal to us because we still need that. I don't want to mention the names of the country, meaning the task to shift to renewable energy is not easy. It's not easy, and but it doesn't mean that we don't want to go to that direction, because Indonesia, of course, we are one of the countries that will be seriously impacted by climate change, right? Because, as you know, Indonesia consists of 17,000 islands, and can you imagine if we see a high rise of sea level, then some of our islands will be submerged, even Jakarta itself. So it's a really challenge for us how to balance between, the understanding of the impact of our climate change on Indonesia, and how to continue working on, developing our economy, because Indonesia, and ladies and gentlemen, is a big country. We're a country of 270 million people. So, it's not easy to strike the balance, to be very frank. If you want to go directly to renewable, then there will be high impact on our economic growth, because there are still around 40 million Indonesian people are still living below poverty line. So it's not easy. And remember, if Indonesia is not prosperous, if Indonesia is not stable, if Indonesia is not democratic, then the impact will be felt by everybody in the Southeast Asia region. So remember that. To make Indonesia prosperous is everybody's task. It's our task first, of course, but to make Indonesia keeps on prospering would serve everybody's interest, trust me. So I'm thankful, we are thankful that our government understands that notion. And even if you look at the plan of the plan of relocating our capital to Kalimantan, actually is part of our effort to in energy transition, because for instance, I couldn't disclose it in detail, but at least I give you just some perspective. Out of 230,000 hectares that are going to be part of this new capital, actually the government seat is only comprises 400 hectares, right? And out of those 400 hectares, only 30% that will be built, while the rest is left as greeneries. So what we are trying to say is that we try to to drive our economy into more green based one by having this mega project. And actually, by having that new capital in that island, Kalimantan, the multiplier effect of having that capital would be also felt by Malaysia and Brunei, and even probably the southern part of the Philippines, because the design of the capital will be 1.5 million inhabitants living in that area and its surrounding areas, right? Combined with Balikpapan, which has, it's a sprawling city just in the southern part of the new capital. comprises 700,000 inhabitants, then you would see, you know, a new center of growth. But of course, the notion, the importance of sustainable development is already there. It's really factored in from the beginning of the design of this new capital. I think there will be other that I could share here, but again, if I may have some 1 minute to respond, I agree with the polling. The absence of political will is pretty strong because, as I said, striking the balance between, you know, go green and continuing the growth, you know, sometimes are colliding with each other. And but it doesn't mean we can be complacent, but that's the fact on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Ferry, for your very honest reflections and for pointing out the real challenge that you have in this short-term gain versus short-term pain versus long-term gain issue. And I also thanks for mentioning particularly the importance of taxonomy. We've had a couple of questions from the audience about greenwashing and how do we reduce that and how do we target better investments. And my answer to that would be, as Pak Ferry pointed out already, the answer is taxonomy, and more taxonomy. That also helps to target investments. It also helps to make sure that when we're investing in something with a label, we really know what it is that we're investing in. So thanks for pointing that out. And I'd now like to, we're running a little bit out of time, but if okay with the organizers, I'd like to keep us for an extra 5 to 7 minutes. I wanted to ask Khun Parosh, if you can comment on particularly the issue around bonds, I think raised already by Pak Ferry, but also through audience questions, and it's in the report as well. Thailand has made really good strides on using bonds, especially during COVID recovery and for green projects. So from your perspective, Khun Parosh, what lessons can you impart to the region from what Thailand has done on green bonds, particularly sovereign? Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Can hear you, great, thank you.
Great. So I just want to make, before I go into the financing side, I just want to make a quick comment that I think everybody's on board, you know, for a long-term goal that we do need to reduce emission, climate change. I think that's quite clear. And it's probably in most government plans already. But I think the big challenge now is, and for me, I agree with the political will, but also the painful transition to green as well. I think that's difficult, and because of COVID, because of Russia, Ukraine, commodity price rising, oil price rising, it's made that pain even more painful. To be honest, I think you know, how do we help people who came out of COVID situation in a very uneven recovery? You know, low income people more affected. They are just barely getting by, you know, from rising food prices, no income, and also rising oil price. So I think government knows that in the long term, we do need to address the issue of green. We're already too late, but we are the last generation to do something about it. But then again, how can we not subsidize energy, electricity, oil, all of which are, you know, fossil fuel based, just so people can actually get by in the short term. So I think that's a huge challenge, but I do think that the long-term goal is still there. Nevertheless, I think the Thai government, you know, announced in COP26, primary account of COP26, our big goal. I saw in the presentation about growth opportunities. I think, you know, with COVID, I think we saw that the marine biodiversity, the beaches can recover when people are away from it. So I think we can take a lot from that. And I think we already done some of that, you know, closing some islands, some beaches, and we saw some serious recovery. So I think long-term sustainable tourism has to be the goal. Then again, a bit about agriculture, is a huge sector in Thai economy. I know they have to change their ways and also, you know, reduce the contribution to the emissions, but how do you change the behavior of people who's been doing that for 100 years? I think that's a difficult situation. That's a big challenge in order to change behavior in the agriculture sector. Another thing, I think, you know, EV cars, I think the government's already, you know, encouraging that through subsidies. So we are doing a lot of stuff in terms of transition. And just to go to your question, I think the financing side can play a huge role in that. There's 2 points here. I think, COVID borrowing has made the fiscal situation for most countries more difficult. I think so. To address that, I think prudent debt management is important. How do you make sure you have instruments available, domestic market liquidity, bond market development, in order to actually just finance any investment as well as green. But also, I think we made a huge effort 2 years ago in terms of being more specific in issuing the sustainability bond. And actually, we had a lot of help from a lot of people, ADB, other sovereigns, in terms of getting the right framework, just making sure that the bond is well received by all types of investors. So what we did was, after years and years of just exploring whether we should do or not, I think it just all came down to, it sounds a bit simple, but actually what happened is that, higher up policy, the Director General just said, look, we just have to do it, right? There's no more time for looking into the cost comparison. I think it's just, the time is now, and we just started the process. And we made sure that it in line with all the standards, ICMA, ASEAN Green Bond Standards. And we thought that green and social issues are heavily linked. People in low income areas can recover more, harder to recover from any disaster related to climate change, and that, further exacerbate the inequality issue. So we thought a sustainability bond was more appropriate for the time being. And we used the proceeds for the mass transit, for clean transportation, and also COVID relief. The challenges, I think, for sovereign, I think, we have hundreds of different agencies doing different things. It's not like a corporate where everything's under one roof. So sometimes it is a bit difficult to, get people on board. They have to do reporting. But in the end, I think we set up a committee. I think that's a very important factor here for other considering. A committee containing all types of agencies involved, project evaluation, making sure the money goes in the right place, the financing, the market side. I think that helped, strengthen the collaboration between everyone. So the first one was a huge success. We had investors from offshore, onshore, different types of investors. We have a huge demand, 3 times over the actual amount. And so far we issued over 230 billion Thai baht worth of sustainability bond, and we plan to do that more going forward. The difficulty we see is, finding the right projects. As any sovereign, any corporate, sometimes it's very, very hard to find the right green projects, making sure that it's actually helpful. So we try to look to that and also explore other instruments as well, sustainability linked bonds, removing the ring fence on projects, just having goals. So I think we will try to work with other agencies, other stakeholders in order to further grow this market. And so we can support the government in their efforts in doing that. And just one more point, I think, cross-border cooperation is important as well. So we are actually encouraging other countries or other corporates to do the baht bond in Thailand, so issue the baht denominated bonds. And also we give special consideration if it's actually a green project as well. So I think that's one small step. I think we can make across the collaboration more tangible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Khun Parosh. And I think especially for sharing. So what finally kicked it off, the successful Thailand COVID recovery bond story was actually political will, high level management after years of looking at it, just saying, okay, we've got to go with it. So we are now out of time, in fact, 5 minutes over. But before we close, I wanted to ask each of the panelists for one reflection, 1 minute or less, on political will. If there's one thing that you need to do, or that you would do, or that your organization would do, or that you would recommend somebody else to do in the next 2 years to address political will, what would it be? Over to you. Let's go back the other way around. Maybe Kunparo, starting with you, and then Pakferi, then Bona, then Jayant, if that's okay.
I just have a short answer. I think you just have to do it. I think it's an obligation of the government. As a sovereign, I think there's a less issue in terms of costs. I think we just have to, for example, for corporate, I think they are really struggling in terms of commodity prices, just struggling to survive. But I think for government, there's no excuse to keep that benchmark going in terms of financing, and also keep raising awareness. Any small things that we can do, for example, just a quick example, a new Bangkok governor comes in, he realizes it's a long time for infrastructure to take in place. Just planting 1 million trees is a small step that everybody at every level, not just high level, as individual, I think we all have to do it.
Okay, thanks, Kunparo. That's a really good point, and awareness as well as let's just get on with it. Okay, Pakferi, what about you?
Thank you, Naida. I agree that absence of political will is one of the factors that still hinders the effort to go to green, let's say green economy, right? So what I'm gonna do, and I've been doing this since August 2020, just to give you the time frame, right? I'm going to continue working with the line ministries to instill these the importance of shifting towards this green investment, green economy. It's not for serving others, but it does serve Indonesian interests. As I said, will be heavily impacted if climate change is not mitigated. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunparo. That's really good. So that's awareness and communication, but with line ministries. Bona.
Yeah, so highlighting that once again, the potential of ensuring a gender just green recovery for unlocking growth. It's $160 trillion in GDP growth. So how to do that and ensure that women really are participating and benefiting. Affirmative action, targeted policies, targeted strategies, set goals, and targeted financing allocation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bona. That's a good menu. And finally, Jan, last but not least.
Thank you, Naida. Yeah, I think, the challenge is bridging this political cycle with the environmental cycle, or again, coming back to short-term and long-term. Political cycles last between 3 to 5 to 6 years, but the environmental challenge is, a truly long-term challenge. So how do we bridge that gap? Well, one way is actually, again, drawing parallels from the trade literature, is our hands are tied approach. When you make commitments to external agreements like the Paris Agreement, and there's others, SDGs and so on, the Paris Agreement is a legally binding commitment. So this is how you can address local or domestic vested interests that might stand in your way of making these difficult short-term pain, long-term gain decisions. So I think, so selling the message might be difficult given the electoral cycle, but politicians have to say, our hands are tied, we have to do this, we've made these external commitments, and push through with them.
So leverage the international agreements. Okay, well, that's a good ending point. Thank you very much for joining. I'd like to give a hand to the panel who've been really excellent and for staying with us till the end, and to the 280 odd people that have also stayed, including for the additional 10 minutes. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to close the webinar now. I hope you can access the reports and the links, and look forward to continuing to work with everybody in the region to promote a green recovery. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks,
Thank you.
Dulce, and Nadia. Thanks so much.